Well, today we come to a new series. Having journeyed throughout most of the summer, as we said a moment ago, in the book of James, and I'm really excited about our journey into this new series called Falling Upward. I've really been wanting to teach on this for a while. I'm excited about moving into this with you for two reasons. One, I've wanted to teach on this topic because it is something that we all know a lot about, right? Brokenness and failure, yearning for wholeness in life, but not always finding it. Those things are part of, they've been a part of, they will be a part of our lives moving forward. Not a negative thought, just the way life is. And so it's helpful for us periodically just to process these things as God would have us process them. So that's one reason I'm excited to bring this to you over the next several weeks. Jason, I'm not sure where you are, but if you could do something with my mic. Okay. Jason, if you can hear me, help me with my mic. He can't. So one reason I'm excited to journey into this series with you is because this is something that we really need to talk about from time to time. But then secondly, I'm so glad we're moving into this series for this reason. Because far too often, when we deal with brokenness, when we deal with failure, far too often our primary mentality is, honestly, how can I just get through this? And it's important for us to catch ourselves when we start thinking like that for this reason. Because God, far from wanting to just help us survive our brokenness, God is wanting to use our failure and our brokenness. He didn't bring it into our lives. He didn't create it. But nonetheless, He's wanting to use our failure and our brokenness in ways that can make us more, in ways that can truly grow us, in ways that honestly can take us to places we would have never gotten to had we not experienced some of the brokenness that we experience. Now, as we kick things off today, let's be very, very, very clear. Our intent in this series is not to glorify brokenness or glorify failure. I'm glad you guys could join us. Are you able to get to do something with that? I don't know if but it sure is kind of crackling. As we kick things off today, let's be very, very clear. Our intent in this series is not to glorify brokenness. We're not trying to glorify failure. We're not trying to point to these things in order to say, man, we're glad these are in our lives. These are great things. Instead, what we want to talk about is this: how these kinds of things, interestingly, can lead us in two very different directions. And thus, we've got to ask, why is it that God can use brokenness for good in some of our lives, while other people find their brokenness, their failures, just lead them to more of the same thing? Why is that? As a pastor over the past 28 years, I've had so many chances to talk to individuals, to talk to couples struggling with brokenness. And what a beautiful thing it's been to watch some of them move through their brokenness in a way that's taken them to a higher plane, honestly. Conversely, I think you can imagine how devastating it's been to watch some people just get stuck in their brokenness. And so again, what we want to talk about today is this: what causes some people to fall upward while other people honestly just fall? The answer to that today, in part, comes back to what I'm calling 4 stages of brokenness. These stages that every person has got to move through if they're going to keep from getting stuck. And let me just say this about these stages. To some degree, each stage builds upon the one before it. Meaning, I know you get it, let me just say it, you got to really move through and process stage 1 before you can fully engage stage 2, and so on and so on. And so here's what I'm asking you to do today. Make a commitment, because of the nature of this series and this topic. Man, make a commitment today that you're going to be here each week in this series, because that's just going to be so important. So make that commitment today. Now, a great place to find these stages, and also a great place to find someone who does eventually end up falling upward. A great place to turn is where we turn today, to the book of Exodus, and therefore to the life of Moses. I love this book because the narrative is such a profound one. It is one that begins with brokenness, but it's also one that ends up with a wholeness that only God can bring. And let me say two things about that. One, that wholeness comes because Moses and the Israelites do indeed move through each stage that we're going to talk about in this series, absolutely. But let me say this as well. And this is good news for us as human beings. They don't always embrace each stage immediately, and they don't always move through it well. In fact, sometimes with these stages, they reject them, and they get stuck. And I hope it's their humanness that we can embrace today so that we can find ourselves in the story. I hope we can learn even more from this passage as we connect with them in the midst of their brokenness and failure, and really we journey into this narrative. Now, in verses 1 through 7 of chapter 1, and I'm not going to read all of these verses, but I do want to at least talk about what we find in them. In verses 1 through 7, we learn that the descendants of Joseph and Jacob have come down from Canaan to Egypt. And because they've grown so quickly in numbers, because they have such a strong cultural identity, that's leading Pharaoh to be very nervous. It's leading him to be quite concerned. And that leads him to this response in verses 8 through 11. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And then if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, they will fight against us, and they will leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. So with one fell swoop, with one executive order, Pharaoh was trying to immerse the people of Israel in what? He's trying to immerse them in brokenness. And yet when the results aren't all that he wants them to be, he eventually then gives this order. Talk about the extreme when it comes to creating brokenness for a people. Verse 22, then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile. Now imagine this. In the midst of all of that, one Hebrew baby boy is born. He is thrown into the Nile, and yet he's thrown in such a way so that this might happen. Being placed in a basket, he is found by, you ready? Pharaoh's daughter. So here is this child who was to be killed, now living in the royal palace. All is great for him, as we might assume, for Moses, until this happens. And this is where brokenness begins for Moses. Imagine him out and about, seeing a young Egyptian soldier mistreating one of the Hebrew workers. His compassion is so great, albeit misguided, that he, in a fit of anger, kills the soldier. That leads him to take off, to run away, to eventually seek safety in the wilderness in a place called Midian. Here we have, we might say, the one Hebrew who could have saved his people, in that he had the resources, he had the power, and yet instead of being able to do that, here is Moses now feeling like he doesn't have much of a future at all. He's reached the end in his mind. And it's into the midst of that deep brokenness that this now happens. Exodus 3:1 says this. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. It's in the midst here of Moses' curiosity, his intrigue, his openness to this bizarre sight. He doesn't say, I've been out in the sun too long, I think I'll go home. Instead, he's at least open to the possibility of what's going on here. It's in the midst of that we see him taking a first step toward the first stage of brokenness. That first stage being this willingness to approach God even in the midst of our deepest struggles, this willingness to approach God with the specific thing, failure, addiction, betrayal, abuse, trauma, you name it. The first stage here is the willingness to surrender whatever has led to the brokenness, to surrender that to God. And so our question today is this: what's involved in this kind of surrender? Involved in this kind of surrender, if it's going to be the kind of surrender that begins to lead us beyond our brokenness. I hate to use So our question today, what's involved in this kind of surrender? If it's going to be the kind of surrender that begins to lead us beyond brokenness. If you'd like to hear this sermon with no breaks and no distractions, it will be online within a few days. I'm so sorry for all of this today. There are three things that we find in this passage that must always be a part of this kind of surrender. So let's take a look at those today. First, in order to truly surrender our brokenness to God, first we've got to recognize this: that sometimes the most amazing things can happen in the midst of our failure. Or sometimes great things can happen in the midst of our deepest brokenness. And while often that is so counterintuitive, of course it is, we find ourselves in the midst of brokenness and failure, and we can't help but think we're done, just like Moses did. And yet when we begin to feel that, we've got to get past that. We've got to embrace the possibility of what God might do if we're not going to get stuck in our brokenness. One of the things you realize when you read this narrative is that the only reason Moses has this intense encounter with God, hear this, the only reason he has this experience with God is because of his failure. The only reason he has this experience, one that leads him to believe he can get past his failure, the only reason that happens is because he's in the wilderness. And why is that the case? Not just for him, but often for us. Because often when we've reached our lowest point, often then we are most open to the divine. Or often when we find ourselves in the wilderness of brokenness, often then, and I bet you've experienced that's when we're most open to God doing something truly amazing. Ask yourself initially today, in the midst of your own brokenness or anticipating brokenness in the future, ask yourself first today, in the midst of brokenness, are you willing to surrender yourself to the possibility of God doing something really great? Because as soon as you do that, the divine will become more clear, more real, and more powerful in your situation. Secondly, in order to truly surrender our brokenness to God, we've got to recognize this, that it's when God often seems most hidden that he's really most active. Hear that again. It's when God seems most hidden that he is often the most active. Here's what's kind of interesting when it comes to the book of Exodus, especially chapters 1 and 2. In these first two chapters, God really is only mentioned a couple of times in chapters 1 and 2. When we read that, when we see that, that could lead us to assume God is really absent, very absent, in the midst of these bad things that are happening for Moses, for the Israelites. And yet, what do we know beyond a doubt as we watch the rest of the story unfold? We know that God is never more active than he is at this time. It's just that he's active behind the scenes. He's working in Moses' life behind the scenes when he's rescued from the Nile. He's working in Moses' life behind the scenes when he feels deep compassion for a Hebrew brother. He's especially working in Moses' life behind the scenes when he needs a place to escape to. Bottom line, if God had not been active in the midst of all of that, Moses would have never become the humble leader he needed to become. How much humility do you think he could have gained in the royal palace? Probably not much. If God had not been active in the midst of all of this, Moses wouldn't have become the leader he needed to become. So of course, even though God might have seemed hidden, he was very active. And so it is with us. Guys, I want to challenge you today to think of a moment in your life, or perhaps because of our time together today, you'll be better able to do this moving forward. But I want you to think of a moment in your life when you could not see God with you in a certain situation, could not see God at all, and yet now as you look back, you realize God was not only there, God was doing a lot. As you carry that image to the forefront of your mind today, ask yourself, how can you more and more and more, as you move forward in life, really trust, again, when God seems most hidden, he's actually most active. Because the more you can do that, then the more you're surrendering, the more you're giving your brokenness to God, the more real that's going to be. And then lastly, in order to surrender our brokenness to God, we've got to recognize this. It sounds so simple, but we got to say it and we got to claim it. Lastly, in order to fully surrender ourselves to God, our brokenness to God, we've got to realize this. We are weak and he is strong. And here's why that's such a critical final piece of the puzzle. Because far too often when we face failure, when we face brokenness, saying, I am weak, is often not where most of us go. Instead, initially, what we often want to do in the midst of our brokenness is this. We want to dive in and try to fix things. We think for some reason that if we just try harder, then we can eliminate our weakness. Truth is, the surrender that's needed, if we're not going to get stuck in our weakness, the surrender that's needed must always be built upon surrendering in part to God's strength. So lastly, ask yourself, in the midst of your brokenness, are you far too often looking to self to fix things, only to find that the weakness of self is what got you where you are in the first place? There's a reason why the lyrics are what they are when we sing. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong. Man, what do we know as we move through life? It's not just the little ones that are weak, is it? And thus, not only do we need to sing that line periodically, man, in our lives daily, we got to strive to live it out, especially as we surrender our brokenness to God. For we are weak, but he is strong. Toby Mac, a Christian artist, in one of his songs, he writes this: something will grow from all you are going through, and it will be you. Guys, that's what we're talking about in this series to some degree, how our brokenness in God's hands is actually something that can make us so much stronger, so much better, if we would work through it in a certain way. And so again, I invite you as we close, make a commitment to yourself and God today, not just to process through what we've talked about today. Make a commitment to be here also the next 3 weeks. Let's pray.